Welcome back to Real Talk Horror, the podcast where we dive into the dark corners of cinema, dissecting the films that leave a mark, whether that's good, bad, or, well, downright bewildering. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and today we're continuing our John Carpenter film breakdown series with what might be the most contentious film in his entire catalog, Ghosts of Mars, released in 2001. Now, if you're a fan of Carpenter's iconic work, you know him as the mind behind legendary films like Halloween, They Live, and The Thing. These are films that redefine the genre with Carpenter's signature blend of suspense, atmosphere, cynicism, and unforgettable characters. But Ghosts of Mars, well, it's a different story, literally and figuratively. This one is, for lack of a better word, a bit of an oddity. It's a film that's as divisive as it is bizarre, and it has earned its spot as one of Carpenter's more questionable efforts. Whether you love it or you hate it, there's no denying that Ghosts of Mars stands out in Carpenter's filmography. It blends science fiction, action, and horror in a way that Carpenter's other films don't, and that's kind of where things get tricky. The film has earned its place in cinema history, not necessarily for reasons Carpenter might have hoped, but because it's unlike anything he's done before. Today we'll unpack what makes Ghosts of Mars so special and how it fits into Carpenter's career, and why it's often labeled as one of his weakest films. This film is a curious case, a mix of high-energy sci-fi action and supernatural horror that struggles to find its footing. Let's take a closer look and dive in, because this is a film that really challenges what we expect from a John Carpenter movie. So before we dive into Ghosts of Mars, it's important to take a step back and consider where the film falls in his career. By the time Ghosts of Mars hits theaters in 2001, Carpenter had already cemented his legacy as one of the most influential filmmakers in the world of horror and genre cinema. As we've mentioned time and again, Halloween to The Thing, They Live, Escape from New York, Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness, so many great films. Carpenter's name was synonymous with innovative filmmaking, tight storytelling, and an unmistakable atmospheric style. But by 2001, things were looking a little different. Carpenter's career had been through some bumps in the road. After the critical successes of his early films, his later works had struggled to find the same level of commercial success and critical acclaim. Films like In the Mouth of Madness and Village of the Damned had not done well at the box office. Even though Carpenter remained a respected figure in the industry, there was a noticeable decline in his output, and his films were becoming less frequent. Now, here's where Ghosts of Mars comes in. This was a movie that Carpenter hoped would be his comeback, a film that could potentially reignite his career. He had been known for his genre-mashing flair, blending horror and other genres to create unique cinematic experiences. Escape from New York, for example, expertly fused dystopian sci-fi with gritty action and has become a cult classic. Ghosts of Mars aimed to capture that same energy, this time blending sci-fi, horror, and action into an ambitious and at times chaotic mix. But let's be honest, the results here are mixed. Carpenter has always been and always will be the kind of filmmaker who worked with limited budgets, often making the most with what he had. But Ghosts of Mars was different. It came with a bigger budget and higher expectations. Yet, it still had that unmistakable Carpenter stamp. The film is set on Mars in the future, where a group of cops has to deal with a strange, violent outbreak that turns the local miners into bloodthirsty, possessed creatures. On paper, this has all the makings of a fun and fascinating Carpenter flick. Strong, flawed protagonist, high-stakes action, a truly isolated setting, and a heavy dose of sci-fi and horror. But this film also marks a shift in Carpenter's approach. It's clear that he was trying to break free from the confines of horror and push into new territory. The film is full of cheesy one-liners, high-octane action scenes, and honestly, an overwhelming sense of chaos. It feels like Carpenter is trying to balance the grim and the ridiculous, and in the process, the tonal balance doesn't land. Now, don't get me wrong, there are moments in this film where you can still feel Carpenter's magic. There's an undeniable energy to it, and at times it feels like he's channeling the spirit of his earlier work. But for every cool moment or compelling character, there's a misstep or odd choice that really takes you out of the experience. It's important to remember that this film came during a time when the industry was shifting. Audiences were less forgiving, and the market for niche genre films was shrinking. Carpenter was no longer a fresh-faced director who had redefined the slasher genre with Halloween, or the master of the sci-fi horror hybrid with The Thing. In fact, the film's mixed reception at the box office was a sign of how far Carpenter had fallen from his earlier heights. At the time, Ghosts of Mars felt like a bit of a gamble for Carpenter. Trying now to tap into the more mainstream sci-fi action crowd, his trademark style with the stark visuals and brooding atmosphere didn't mesh with the over-the-top action scenes or the somewhat campy tone that the film often leads into. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. This isn't a film that made a lasting impact, at least not in the way Carpenter early films did. But it's definitely a fascinating chapter in his career, a film that feels like Carpenter was trying to recapture the energy and success of his past, but ultimately couldn't quite get the balance right. And that's where we are with Ghosts of Mars, a film that blends Carpenter's signature genre-blending approach with this very different era of filmmaking. It's a film that feels like a throwback to his older work, but also a desperate attempt to break free from the shadows of his past. It's far from perfect, but it's interesting if nothing else. And it's a film that, despite its flaws, offers a glimpse into the challenges and changes in Carpenter's career during the 2000s. But before we dive deeper into the film itself, let's take a closer look at the plot and what actually happens on Mars. So what is the story of Ghosts of Mars all about? The film takes place in the year 2176 on a Mars that's been colonized by humanity. It's a gritty industrial landscape filled with miners and settlers working to carve out a life on the red planet. The central story unfolds through a series of flashbacks as Lieutenant Melanie Ballard, played by Natasha Henstridge, recalls a mission gone horribly wrong. And from the moment the film begins, you can tell this isn't going to be the typical sci-fi romp. Ballard and her team are dispatched to a remote mining outpost to transport a prisoner. Desolation Williams, played by none other than Ice Cube. Williams is a notorious criminal who's been locked up for a string of violent crimes and is being taken to a higher security facility because of those crimes. But when they arrive, things quickly start to fall apart, because it turns out that the miners at this outpost have stumbled upon something far worse than a dangerous criminal. The miners have unearthed a dormant alien force, a mysterious and vengeful spirit that's been lying in wait for centuries. When the miners are exposed to it, they're quickly possessed by these spirits and transformed into bloodthirsty, violent warriors. The entire colony goes into chaos as the possessed miners begin hunting down anyone they can find. It's not long before Ballard and Williams, along with a ragtag group of survivors, find themselves fighting for their lives, struggling to escape Mars before they too fall prey to the spirits that have taken control of the colony. Ghosts of Mars is about survival and isolation, a film where characters are trapped on an inhospitable world with the clock ticking and danger closing in on from all sides. It's also about the consequences of colonial exploitation, a theme Carpenter explored before in films like They Live, where the powerful oppress the weak, leading to disastrous consequences. Here it's the miners who are sent to Mars with little regard for their well-being, only to awaken an ancient force that turns the tables on their colonizers. The film is a bit of a commentary on the unintended consequences of human expansion and the arrogance of thinking we can control nature or that we can control the unknown. But this is where Ghosts of Mars gets a little tricky. While the themes are compelling, the film's execution doesn't do them justice. Carpenter attempts to weave together this thoughtful critique of colonialism with a blood-pumping, high-octane action film, and you can feel the effort. There are definitely moments where the potential for something more profound is lurking just beneath what we see. But instead of diving into these themes with the depth we've seen from Carpenters in the past, the movie often feels bogged down by the chaotic pacing, uneven tone, and lack of real character development. Instead of slowing down to explore the heavier themes, the film pushes forward with action sequences, a lot of gunfights, and some extremely over-the-top moments. The result is that it sometimes feels more like style over substance kind of film, which can be frustrating because the premise had so much promise. Carpenter has always been known for his ability to blend social commentary with horror and tension, but here the balance just isn't quite there. Still, it's hard not to appreciate the scope of ambition on Ghosts of Mars. It's a film that throws everything at the wall: sci-fi, action, horror, campiness, all thrown in for good measure. It's a movie that never takes itself too seriously, but also at times tries to be more than it can manage. There's a lot going on. That never fully lands as a cohesive narrative, but there are still flashes of Carpenter's trademark style throughout. It's just that, much like The Possessed Miners, the film feels little out of control, careening from one set piece to the next without considering the overall impact. But I guess that's kind of the fun with Carpenter's later films. I mean, he was always willing to experiment, even if it meant taking risks that didn't always pay off. And in Ghosts of Mars, that experimentation results in a movie that's messy, but filled with ambition. But let's dive deep next into the specifics of the film, the characters, and how Carpenter manages to deliver on some of his familiar themes in this totally different environment. So let's go behind the curtain and see what's going on. There's a lot to unpack there, especially when we look at the production itself. The film had a budget of around $28 million, which at the time was a pretty decent amount for a Carpenter project. But as we watch the movie unfold, you quickly realize that the money didn't seem to stretch as far as you might expect for a big budget sci-fi flick. From the dusty, minimalistic sets on Mars to the special effects that feel kind of cheesy, the film often feels more like a low-budget B-movie than a sweeping sci-fi epic it was trying to be. Carpenter attempts to make Mars feel like a harsh, desolate world, and that's commendable. But the production design never really sells that sense of scale and wonder. The sets, which are mostly shot in the desert, don't have the same immersive feel as something like the Antarctic outpost in The Thing or the prison of New York in Escape from New York. Instead, we get these stark industrial environments that, while practical, sometimes look like leftovers from a cheaper sci-fi TV show than the futuristic colonized Mars that we were promised. Interestingly, Ghosts of Mars wasn't always intended to be the film we see today. Originally, Carpenter had hoped to make a sequel to Escape from LA, with Kurt Russell reprising his role as the infamous Snake Plissken. It would have been a continuation of the post-apocalyptic, action-packed adventures of the anti-hero Snake. But after the underperformance of Escape from LA, the concept was retooled completely. The Snake Plissken sequel idea was scrapped, and instead Carpenter went in a new direction with a fresh cast and a completely different storyline. Ice Cube was brought in to star as Desolation Williams, a hardened criminal who becomes an unlikely hero. He stepped into the lead role, and in a bit of a twist, Natasha Henstridge was cast as Lieutenant Melanie Ballard, replacing Courtney Love, who had to drop out after an injury. One of the things that's characteristic of Carpenter's style is his willingness to take on multiple roles in production. And as usual, he didn't just direct Ghost of Mars. No, he was the co-writer and the composer. Carpenter, as we've talked about many times in this series, is known for his minimalistic yet incredibly effective approach to filmmaking. He takes on a lot of the creative burden himself, and in this case, again, it includes scoring the film. Carpenter, the master of the synth-driven score, teamed up with bands like Anthrax to create a rock-infused soundtrack that stands out as one of the truly memorable aspects of the film. The music is loud, aggressive, and high energy, and it matches the chaotic, action-heavy tone of Ghost of Mars. But while the soundtrack rocks, the rest of the film doesn't quite hit the same notes. Unfortunately, Ghost of Mars didn't find much success at the box office. Despite its budget, the film only grossed about $14 million, making it a huge disappointment, especially for a director of Carpenter's stature. Critics were not kind to the film, calling it uninspired, dated, and lacking the spark that made Carpenter's earlier work so compelling. They cited the film's over-the-top action and lackluster effects as major drawbacks. And while there's definitely an argument to be made for the film's flaws, it's a bit harsh considering Carpenter's ambitious approach to mixing sci-fi and horror in a way that wasn't being done at the time. Carpenter himself has admitted that Ghosts of Mars was a low point in his career. In fact, he's been pretty open about how the film's failure impacted him. In interviews, he's mentioned how the movie's reception and struggles at the box office were part of the reason he stepped away from directing for nearly a decade after its release. For a filmmaker who had revolutionized horror and sci-fi, it was a tough pill to swallow. But in true Carpenter fashion, he took a step back, reevaluated his approach, and eventually he did return to filmmaking, but with a different mindset. Now, when we talk about the challenges Carpenter faced on this film, we can't ignore the tough production issues that were happening behind the scenes. As I mentioned, Courtney Love had to drop out due to an injury, which led to Natasha Henstridge stepping into that lead role. Henstridge at the time was probably best known for her role in Species, and while she brings a certain toughness to the role of Lieutenant Ballard, her character doesn't really have the depth you'd expect. Some of the supporting characters also feel underdeveloped, which doesn't help with the film's pacing or its ability to get us emotionally invested. At the end of the day, Ghosts of Mars feels like an experiment that didn't pan out. Carpenter's style is present: gritty, action-packed sequences, high energy, themes of isolation and survival. But the overall product just didn't come together in a way that fully satisfied anyone, critics or audiences. Despite that, there's something fascinating about seeing Carpenter's vision on screen, even if the execution didn't hit the mark. And as much as the film struggles with its budget constraints, it's still worth noting that Carpenter did his best to make something entertaining, even if it ended up feeling disjointed. So while Ghosts of Mars wasn't the comeback vehicle Carpenter had hoped for, it's an important chapter in his career. It's a film that shows what can happen when a legendary director has more freedom, a bigger budget, and a lot of creative ambition, but maybe not the right elements to pull it all together. Still, it's a memorable experience for fans of Carpenter's work, and for better or worse, it's a film that stands out. Now let's shift gears and dive a bit more into some of the themes and cinematic techniques Carpenter used in Ghosts of Mars, and why, despite its flaws, it might still be worth talking about. Even though Ghosts of Mars is often considered one of Carpenter's, or maybe Carpenter's, weakest efforts, there's no denying that his signature style is still very much present. Carpenter always had a unique approach to filmmaking, and even here, in this wild mix of sci-fi, action, and horror, you can see his creative fingerprints all over the place. So let's break down how his style manifests in Ghosts of Mars, from the atmosphere to the visuals to the music. First up, one of Carpenter's most well-known trademarks, his love for isolated settings. Whether it's the eerie isolation of a small town on Halloween or the claustrophobic tension of an Antarctic research station, Carpenter has a way of creating environments that feel like traps, where the characters are cut off from the world and forced to confront whatever danger lurks within. Ghosts of Mars, that sense of isolation is translated into the desolate, hostile environment of Mars itself. The planet is a vast, empty wasteland, and the setting feels as oppressive as it is unforgiving. In a way, Mars becomes its own character in the film. It's cold, alien, and dangerous, with a sense of dread hanging over every scene. And Carpenter does an excellent job of setting up the idea that Mars is a place where no one is really safe. It's a world on the brink of chaos, with its inhabitants struggling to survive the hostile environment. However, while the setting has that classic Carpenter sense of isolation, the execution is more of a mixed bag. The story unfolds through a series of flashbacks, which on paper might seem like a great way to build suspense and reveal plot twists, but in practice, the layered structure tends to muddle the narrative. Instead of creating the tension and intrigue that Carpenter usually does so well, the film ends up feeling disjointed, and the flashbacks end up diluting the tension rather than enhancing it. The storytelling is far from smooth, and you're left trying to piece together what's happening and why it matters. It's a little harder to connect with the characters when the plot isn't presented in a straightforward or compelling way. Now, if you've ever seen a Carpenter film, you know that his visual style is another huge part of his filmmaking identity. In Ghosts of Mars, you can see that Carpenter is trying to maintain his iconic visual flair, but with a much grittier, more brutal edge. The movie leans heavily into the use of red filters and harsh lighting, a stylistic choice that gives the film a fiery, hellish atmosphere. This works well in certain scenes, especially when the possessed miners are running wild and the whole setting feels like a war zone. The red tint in particular does an excellent job of conveying the sense that Mars is literally burning up, a planet on the brink of collapse and destruction. It's a nice visual nod to Carpenter's earlier work in The Thing, where he used the icy cold of Antarctica to trap his characters in a tense, claustrophobic nightmare. Here, he's using the harshness of Mars to create that same feeling of entrapment, but on a much larger scale. However, as much as Carpenter is still trying to nail down the visuals that made his earlier films iconic, Ghost of Mars doesn't capture that same magic. The framing and composition of many shots just don't hit at the same level of tension that we saw in works like Assault on Precinct 13 or They Live. In those films, Carpenter knew exactly how to build suspense with tight shots, slow zooms, and the perfect use of light and shadow. In Ghosts of Mars, the shots sometimes feel flat or a bit too generic, lacking any visual punch that you would expect from one of his films. It's clear he's going for a more stylized, high-octane look, but the energy doesn't always translate into the frame. But if there is one thing that Carpenter's known for, something that consistently stands out in his films, it's his music. Carpenter's scores are something legendary, with their synthesizer-driven melodies and pulse-pounding beats that perfectly complement the tension and mood of his films. Ghosts of Mars is no exception. But this time, Carpenter took a bold departure from his usual style and brought in a heavy metal influence. The score is loaded with gritty, hard rock guitar riffs, and Carpenter collaborated with bands like Anthrax to give the film a more aggressive, rock-infused sound. It's a departure from the eerie synths of Halloween or The Fog, but there's something undeniably exciting about hearing Carpenter mix his atmospheric, synth-driven sound with a heavier, in-your-face tones of metal. The problem is, though, that the heavy metal vibe doesn't always match up with the on-screen action. The music is high energy, but sometimes it feels disconnected from the film itself. The riffs and pounding drums are great during some of the action sequences, but in quieter moments, or during more atmospheric scenes, the music feels like it's trying to be louder than the story itself. Carpenter's music typically works because it perfectly aligns with the mood of the scene, subtly building tension and enhancing emotion of the moment. Here, though, the rock elements feel like they're competing with the film, rather than working in harmony with it. It's not bad per se, but it's definitely a different flavor than we've come to expect from Carpenter's usual minimalistic atmospheric scores. And let's not forget that Carpenter is a director who thrives on simplicity, whether it's in the visual approach, his characters, or his use of music. While the heavy metal score is a fun experiment, it's not as effective as the understated atmospheric music he is known for. It's a bold choice, but it doesn't quite fit the tone of the film, which at times feels like it's struggling to find its identity between sci-fi, horror, and action. Now, Ghosts of Mars definitely carries Carpenter's signature style, especially in terms of the desolate setting, the use of the red filters and harsh lighting, and unique music. The final result ends up being a mixed bag. His love for isolation and creating hellish atmospheres is still there, but the execution, far more uneven. The ambitious structure and bold stylistic choices don't always come together as seamlessly as they have in his best work. But hey, that's what makes Carpenter's career so fascinating. Even when things don't go as planned, there's usually something worth exploring, something that sets his work apart from the rest. Ghosts of Mars is not his best film, but it's still a Carpenter film. Rough around the edges, flawed, but uniquely his. And that's something we can always appreciate. So stay tuned as we dig deeper into some of the bigger themes and moments in Ghosts of Mars and explore what it makes this film worth revisiting despite those flaws we've seen. Now, what's the legacy of Ghosts of Mars? Unlike films like The Thing or Big Trouble in Little China, this one has not found its place in the pantheon of cult classics. Instead, it's often remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when a legendary director's vision doesn't land the way he intended. When you think about Carpenter's body of work, the films have often pushed boundaries, blending genres and introducing new ideas into horror and sci-fi. But Ghosts of Mars, it's a little different. It didn't do what some of his other films did. It didn't revolutionize or elevate a genre. It didn't become something fans look back on with adoration. Instead, it was met with mostly negative reviews and underwhelming box office returns. But does that mean that it's a total loss? Not necessarily. For some, Ghosts of Mars has developed a strange niche charm. There are fans of Carpenter's work, particularly those who appreciate his more offbeat and experimental films, that still find something entertaining here. Maybe it's the campy energy or the wild combination of action, sci-fi, and horror. It's certainly not a film that takes itself too seriously, and for some viewers, that's part of its appeal, that so bad it's good side of things. And don't get me wrong, Ghosts of Mars isn't a hidden gem. It hasn't inspired the same kind of adoration as Escape from New York or The Thing, but it is interesting in its own way. The film's chaotic energy, the over-the-top performances, and the kind of rock and roll aesthetic that Carpenter brought to the film still leaves an impression. It's a movie that doesn't care about being polished or even being cohesive, but instead is willing to embrace that messiness and that kind of freewheeling spirit that resonates with some fans. For the hardcore Carpenter fan, Ghost of Mars is still a reminder of his willingness to take risks, even if those risks don't pay off. Carpenter never really played it safe, and this film is no exception. That blend of sci-fi, horror, and action feels like it's a throwback to earlier B-movies, at least more so than something that could stand up with his more successful works. But there's something to be admired about a director who's willing to take a swing at something that might not work, as opposed to just repeating the same formula over and over again. And then, of course, the music, rock-infused score that Carpenter crafted with help of some more famous bands. It doesn't quite resonate with the tone of the movie, but it's an interesting experiment like the rest of the film. Ghosts of Mars didn't change the genre or earn Carpenter any respect that some of his other films have, but it left a legacy of its own. Not every movie has to be a masterpiece to have an impact. Sometimes a film can simply serve as a reminder of a director's unique voice and their desire to push the boundaries of what a genre film could be. For better or worse, this is an example of what happens when a director with a rich history of classic films steps into unfamiliar territory and tries to bring something new, sometimes messy, into the world. And maybe that's what'll make it fascinating for some. It's not perfect, not by a long shot, but it is part of the Carpenter journey. And for those who still enjoy the chaotic high energy of the film, it's a cult curiosity that gets at the heart of Carpenter's unfiltered, genre-bending spirit. It's the kind of film that reminds us not everything a director's career has to be flawless. Sometimes it's just about taking risks, seeing what sticks, and owning the result, whatever it may be. So how has Ghosts of Mars been received over time? Like I mentioned, when it was first released, the reception was less than kind. Critics were harsh. And not just the "this didn't quite work" reviews. It was more like, "this is a mess. It doesn't even seem like Carpenter knows what kind of movie he's making." Ouch kind of stuff. For a filmmaker with a reputation for creating some of the most influential horror and sci-fi films of all time, Ghosts of Mars seemed like a major misstep. And honestly, it was hard to blame critics for feeling that way. The film's blend of genre never quite gels, and it's all wrapped up in a package that feels a bit outdated, even for 2001. It's like Carpenter took a swing at a genre mashup, but it landed with more of a thud than a punch. But as time has gone on, it has gotten its own a little bit of a cult following, though not in the way you'd expect. For some, the film's campiness, over-the-top characters, and chaotic energy have become its redeeming qualities. A charm in its messiness. It's that kind of charm that only cult classics can pull off. It's a movie that doesn't take itself seriously, and for those who appreciate that kind of low budget, even though this one didn't have that, high energy insanity, there's fun to be had. So if you watch it like it was a low budget film, it could be a little bit more fun. Still, let's be real here, even those who appreciate it or reappraise it with a nostalgic lens aren't calling it one of Carpenter's masterpieces. They're not even calling it one of his better movies. It's more like they're saying, yeah, it's a mess, but it's our mess. Fans are embracing the wildness, oddness, and the flaws. but at the same time, it's clear that the movie never really made it out of the critical shadow. Most still consider it probably his weakest effort, even with the benefit of hindsight. For completionists like myself, those who love diving into every corner of a director's career, it offers an intriguing look at Carpenter trying to evolve with the times. You can see him attempting something new here, especially with the heavy metal soundtrack, the more modern, slick action style, and the futuristic setting. But it's clear that Ghosts of Mars is a director who's out of step with the trends. It's as if Carpenter, at this stage in his career, was just trying to recapture the energy and relevance of his earlier work, but wasn't quite able to blend his signature style with the genre expectations of the moment. So even though it wasn't a hit, it's still interesting to see a director like Carpenter, who's made his mark on genre cinema, continue to try new things. It's easy to imagine him in the late 90s, early 2000s, looking at what was happening in the film world thinking, okay, how do I bring my sensibilities into this new era? The result, being Ghosts of Mars, didn't connect with audiences in the way he had hoped. It still represented an attempt to adapt, even if it fell short. There has never been a major reevaluation. There probably never will be. But there have been some critics and fans who have looked back on it with more forgiving eyes. They appreciate that campiness, the boldness of the style, and the chaotic narrative. But still, Ghosts of Mars sits lower than Carpenter's catalog for the vast majority of people. Does it deserve a reappraisal? Maybe in some ways, but it's clear that it won't ever be remembered as one of his more defining works. It'll always be an odd curiosity, one that leaves us wondering what could have been if the pieces had fit together differently. But for those who have embraced it over the years, it's become a bit of a guilty pleasure, a film that's entertaining for all the wrong reasons. And maybe that's enough for some. So here's my take on Ghosts of Mars. This film is an ambitious mess. I think that sums it up pretty well. It's one of those films that if you squint hard enough, you can see glimpses of Carpenter's signature brilliance buried under clunky dialogue, uneven performances, and some very questionable creative choices. For me, it's a 2 out of 10. Now, I know that's a pretty harsh score, but hear me out. I didn't arrive at that number lightly. I've been a Carpenter fan for years, and I know what he's capable of. And with Ghosts of Mars, you can really feel his intent to make something that blends genres in a way we hadn't seen from him before. You can see the effort, but unfortunately the film doesn't pull it off. It's one of those films where the sum of the parts don't quite add up to the whole. But here's the thing, even a misstep from John Carpenter is still worth talking about. That's the beauty of his career. Even when he stumbles, he's still trying to push boundaries, to experiment with new ideas and new genres. And because of that, Ghosts of Mars, John Carpenter's Vampires, Memoirs of an Invisible Man are all fascinating failures. They're flawed, sure, but there's something about them that keeps you talking. Maybe it's the campy fun of it all, or the oddball characters. Or maybe it's just the way that the film represents a director at a crossroads in their career. Either way, worth revisiting, if only to dissect what went wrong and why it didn't land the way Carpenter intended. Now, do I recommend you watch Ghosts of Mars? Well, that depends what you're looking for. If you are a fan of Carpenter's work, it's kind of a necessary stop in the journey. It's interesting to see what he tried to do, even if it doesn't work. But if you're expecting the kind of tension and atmosphere of The Thing or Halloween, you're going to want to look elsewhere. Ghosts of Mars is definitely an acquired taste, but that's what makes it worth talking about. Carpenter's legacy is built on risk, and this was certainly one. So for all its flaws, it's still a film that'll stick with you. You'll remember it. Now, looking ahead, we're going to wrap up Phase 6 and our breakdown of John Carpenter and his career with his final theatrical film to date, The Ward. This is a film that's kind of flown under the radar for a lot of people. But the question is it a return to form, or is it a quiet fade out for a legendary director? Does Carpenter reclaim his magic, or does he go out with a whimper? I'll be diving into that in the next episode, so you make sure to tune in and find out. But before you go, if you enjoyed today's episode, do me a favor, rate and review the podcast. It helps more people discover the show and get in on the discussion. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads at RealRealTalk for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. I love hearing from you all, so feel free to drop your thoughts, reactions to the episodes, and everything else. Thank you so much for listening to Real Talk Horror. It's been a blast breaking down these films with you, and I can't wait to keep going. I'll catch you next time, right here, where we'll take a closer look at the final film in our Carpenter journey. Until then, stay creepy and keep the real talk alive.